Well, my name is Jim Schwinkendorf, and I am a career railroader. I got my education at Purdue University, and both a master's and a bachelor's degree in management. And I was interested in only working for railroads because that's where my interest has always been. So when I graduated from Purdue in Lafayette, I went to work for a railroad called the Elgin, Joliet and Eastern, which served U.S. Steel. It was owned by U.S. Steel Corporation, served the steel mills in the Gary and Chicago area, and I worked for them for 5 years. And then the fellow that hired me at the EJ&E had moved on to the Milwaukee Road, and I went on to the Milwaukee at their headquarters in Chicago, and I was an analyst. I started out as, and ultimately was Assistant Vice President Operations Planning for the Milwaukee. And when they went into bankruptcy, ultimately they were purchased by the Soo Line, which is owned by Canadian Pacific today. And at that point, I didn't want to move from Chicago to Minneapolis, so I was able to secure a position at Burlington Northern through my contacts that I had along the way. And so I went to work for BN and was headquartered in Denver at the Denver region, and then at the operating department headquarters in Overland Park, Kansas, and finally down at Fort Worth, Texas, where I retired. And when I retired, I was looking for a place. I was a widower, and I had, because of all of my activities with the steam engines and excursions and so forth, in addition to my regular job, which was contracts. So I've done many weird things. I've been the train director for Bill Gates on a special trip. I handled many special events. The 100-year anniversary of Dwight Eisenhower, and we ran special trains for that, and I was in charge for those. So, and I was the steam guru that I knew the group here. Actually, the group out of St. Louis was the first one that asked Burlington Northern to run steam, and that was in 1990. And beyond that time, I got to be on their board of directors. I was the liaison between the railroad and the steam engine, the St. Louis Steam Train Association group. And then ultimately, anytime a steam engine moved or wanted to move or run an excursion, I was the guy that was the sacrificial lamb that went out with it and tried to keep them out of trouble and tried to make everything work well. So I did a lot of excursions with the NRHS, National Railway Historical Society, and special events. So because the steam engine group had the closest and largest number of friends that I had in St. Louis, that's when I didn't want to stay in Texas. So I retired, and I was looking for a nice place that I liked, and I happened to find Pacific because I liked the scenery and so forth. It's close to St. Louis. It was close to the museum. It was close to the steam engine that ran out of the museum, and I had lots of friends over there. So that's how I got to Pacific. Built a place out in Silver Lake Estates, and that's where I've been. I've since remarried, married another railroad person, and who was a photographer in town by the name of Diane Good, and so we live out at Silver Lake Estates, and I've been building my basement railroad, which is somewhat modeled after the Milwaukee Road in Montana, and that's where I spend my time. Because of the change of the world out here and insurance and so forth, why the steam engine excursions just about have died off. The risk of running a steam engine out in front of a trainload of brand new automobiles isn't worth the risk to the stockholders, and all of the modern day management people are interested in what's the next quarter look like on their earnings, not any historic ties of the railroad to it. So Union Pacific is a little bit more of that, and I know the guy that runs their steam program out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. So that's how I got to Pacific, and I keep busy with the model railroad in the basement, and that's where I am. The railroad actually started downtown in St. Louis about 1852, and they got to Barrett's, which is where the Museum of Transportation is located, and it's atop of Kirkwood Hill. And the railroads tend to run to supplies of water because that's the way the steam engine ran. And as I was telling you, the steam engine uses 10 times as much water as it does fuel. So that meant that, and if you look on old track charts, you'll see that every town is like 6 to 10 miles apart, and they all had water supplies, as much as they possibly could. And so they would replenish the water. When we ran, even with the auxiliary tender, you don't want to run out of water. So we would stop and acquire 10,000 gallons of water here at Pacific a lot of times on a run that we had down on the Frisco side, because the 1522 was a 1926 Baldwin from the Frisco, high-speed freight and passenger locomotive of its day, and it had an auxiliary tender with it, but you always get water. When in doubt, take water, and that's what we did, and that's why Pacific was so important, because it's at the bottom of the hill, next to the Merrimack, very close. The tracks are right beside it, and so both for the Frisco side and for the Missouri Pacific, today Union Pacific side, but in the days of steam, it was a place at the bottom of the hill with an adequate, a very good water supply, and you stopped and took water before you tackled the next big hill. And once you got up the next big hill, once you got to the top, you didn't need the steam so much, so you could coast down and go for a ways until you got to the next bottom of the hill or alongside the tracks. So there was you could once you got over the hill on the Missouri Pacific at Summit on the west side of town here and got downside along the Missouri River, you pretty well followed that all the way. So the water supply was not as necessary as it was here. But in town, you had the railroad got here in 1853 when the town was called Franklin. It was they had to wait till they built the tunnels at the top of Kirkwood Hill in order to not go totally over the hill, but were able to go through it. And once they got on the grade on the downside, they were headed straight for the Merrimack River, and the good place to stop with an adequate supply, and everything was right here in Pacific. And that's where you replenish the water supply to tackle the next set of hills out of town, either east or west. So Pacific grew as a railroad town. It had a shop. It had a 6-stall roundhouse and a turntable. It was a important town. It was the end of track in 1853 when they got down here, and then starting westward, it took them 4 years to get from Pacific to Washington, which is not very far, but it was a lot of grading and so forth, and the hill to tackle here, and the original line of the Pacific Railroad, the MOPAC, went up over Summit Hill, over the hill, and then down into Labadie alongside the river again, and you were back into a water supply that way. And it was just, there were 4 water tanks. Ultimately, the town, in addition to the shop facility with the roundhouse and so forth, had a large brick joint depot downtown, and it was a joint facility used both by the original Pacific Railroad and its successor, if you will, that started south-west, and it was headed toward San Francisco and the south. And so it was important to both railroads, but really important to the MOPAC for the water supply. And the Frisco had a hill at Rolla, and then it went down there and into a valley with the Big Piney River and the Little Piney River, at a place called Newburgh, and that was a big yard, roundhouse, everything again to feed the supply of the water. And the water is good at Newburgh. I took water there many times. It was when a steam engine came into town, the way the water system worked, and the way it was important for Pacific, was that you filled a big tank. The water tanks were huge in Pacific, so once the tank was full alongside the track, then when the steam engine came in, it needed the water quickly, but once the steam engine left, you had a long time to fill the tank back up again for the next train that came through and needed water. And so it was just an ideal location for the railroad operations of their day. From 1853, locomotives were small. Railroading was slow back then. You didn't go very far or very fast, and you took water every time you could possibly take it. And it was when you see the pictures of the engineer and the fireman standing beside their locomotive while they were waiting to do things, they weren't out there because they really needed to be outside doing things on the engine as much as taking water and getting out of a very hot, humid cab that if you weren't going very fast, you didn't have air conditioning unless you were going fairly fast. So that's why you always see the guys out alongside the engine. They'd always oil all the bearings and so forth. It was a much slower technology in increments of 10 to 20 miles at a time before you had to stop every time to take more water for the engine. The engine could go from St. Louis to Newburgh with no problem, and then from Newburgh all the way to Springfield with no problem, as long as you had water. And so that's kind of the history of how Pacific got to be the railroad town. It was just in the right place at the right time. The Frisco didn't build southwest until much later, and it got spun off in the great financial crises that betook railroads in the 1870s and so forth. And so that's when it became a separate railroad and built a line from Pacific all the way into St. Louis. So you now had 2 parallel lines coming out here to Pacific, and where they took water. And there's the water supply filled the tenders out of a thing called a standpipe, and it's just a large tube, if you will, pipe, that comes up, and it has an arm on it, and the arm rotates, and so when the steam engine would come in, they'd get close to where the pipe was, swing the arm out, take a big drink of 10,000 gallons of water, and then out of town they'd go, and once the steam got back up, and you were ready to go up the hill. The purpose of the turntable was to put the engine on, which largely was a unilateral direction machine, and turn it, so then it would be able to go back the other way. And engines didn't go very far, even in the, so they literally would go, like I said, from place to place. The roundhouse was a place where you worked on the steam engine. You pulled in with the larger part. As the roundhouse bent around like this, the large end of it was where they could take the front off and work in the boiler and such like that, and then you took it out, spun it around on the turntable, and out of town you went. Those, as steam engines got bigger and more modern, the need for those kind of facilities lessened and lessened and lessened. Although up through the end of steam on the Missouri Pacific, they had a commuter train that came out in 35 and 36 out of St. Louis, and this was the end of the commuter line. There's one of the commuter cars coaches is at Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, and so they would come out this far, 35 miles. They needed water by this point, and no matter which way they were going, they needed to go back up the hill again and use more water. So this was again an ideal spot for that. Directly across the road from where this is taking place, the recording, there was a pump house, and the pump house had pumped water out of the river into pipes, and then the pipe ran alongside the tracks, probably underground, but ran along on the railroad right away and ended up downtown at the passenger station where the 4 water tanks were, and then they filled the water tanks up with a small pump system, probably steam operated. And the world was very different. Everything was either air or steam. You didn't have electricity or anything else. So it filled those 4 great big water tanks that again went through the process of partially filling a, they filled the tanks slowly because you didn't need much and you had time. But when the steam engine came into town, you were moving and you wanted to keep moving, and so you take a big drink of water as fast as you can pump it out of the tank, and off you go again.
BN, it became then BNSF. Why did that occur? What was?
Okay, well, you're into the modern day era of mergers and acquiring more property, and if you looked at a map of the Burlington Northern, you will see that one of the things that it was lacking was a southeast portion that the Frisco fit in just ideally into the infrastructure. So you could go on the BN, you could actually at one time go to Florida on the Frisco and come up through the south, through Memphis, Tupelo, and Mississippi, and down that way. And the Frisco was actually an X if you look at a map. This was, at the top was Kansas City, and where they crossed was Springfield, Missouri, and then down to the southeast would have been Florida and Mississippi and Birmingham, Alabama, and so forth. The other leg of it was from St. Louis, crossed, and then it went down to Texas, Oklahoma, and that territory down there. And so that X fit into the Burlington Northern one, which basically ran out like this, had a leg that came down in the Colorado and Southern, and then went, you know, as west as far as the mountains, and it wasn't. And so the next piece of the puzzle that came in was the Santa Fe. Well, what did that do to the Burlington Northern at that point? It added that missing piece to the southwest that went out to the ports in California. And so that's how BNSF, everything is a piece of it's almost like a puzzle that you just put the railroad pieces together, and pretty soon you have a merged railroad. One of my more interesting things, because I had an operating background and I liked history and so forth, I testified at the Interstate Commerce Commission hearings for the UP-MOPAC merger, and I also testified with the Frisco merger. So another side duty that I had, I had testified before Congress on one particular aspect of railroad business, and I was involved with the Interstate Commerce Commission proceedings on either mergers or abandonments or something like that. So I had a Lionel train set in 1951, and that I liked trains before then, and I liked railroading. I found is an absolutely fascinating business. It's a complicated piece of many parts that all have to work together to see the steel wheel move on the steel rail. And it has engineering, it has marketing, it has economics, it has mechanical aspects, it has civil engineering aspects. So you just, and if you're interested in it, as I have always been, you just gathered this immense amount of information that I've always enjoyed, and I found a fascinating career. I spent 32 years on railroading. Important to get to 30 years, because then you get into the wonderful Railroad Retirement Act, and that keeps bread on the table, so to speak. So yeah, the railroad pieces, you know, and again, it's back into the history of railroading in this country. Was, well, why did the Frisco come into being? Well, the Frisco got paired off from the Missouri Pacific through the financial guys like Jay Gould, who owned the Frisco at one point. He also owned the Santa Fe at one point, and that was the next puzzle that never came into fruition. Was, how was the Frisco going to get to the southwest? It was going to go down to Santa Fe, and those lines still work that way today. So what was out there 120, 30 years ago is still an important part of the railroad picture. The only way you could get anywhere in this country for almost 100 years was by train. The roads were non-existent, and so the first erosion of business that started to come along that was competitive with the railroads would have been the highways, which Pacific was on the wonderful, you know, Mother Road, US 66. So that another facet of interest in Pacific. But then you had Eisenhower in the 50s that started the interstate highway system, and that took more business, and now gave even truckers and people more reason to do it. People didn't want to ride a train anymore. They wanted to get in their car and drive someplace, or get on an airplane and be there in 3, 4, 5 hours. Railroad business, you know, in the 1920s, I just finished doing some research on Pullman, because at one time Pullman was the largest hotel system in the United States. Why? Because everybody rode a Pullman car overnight, and it was for, you know, it was economic. And that's where, when you ask the question, it all leads toward economics somewhere along the way. So as people moved away in cars or away onto airplanes, that killed the passenger business. And once you had a highway system that you could get into St. Louis, there was no reason to really take the train. There weren't that many cars, so it wasn't like going up I-44 behind the work area over here. I can remember as a boy, I had relatives. I'm originally from LaPorte, Indiana, and I had some relatives that lived over in Hillside, Illinois, which is on the west side of Chicago. And it was an all-day car drive to go from LaPorte, Indiana to Hillside, Illinois. Now, you know, I've been on the interstate and do it in about 2 hours down the interstate highway and out that way. So the infrastructure changed, and we're always trying to move something faster and live a faster life. So when the passenger service is very labor intensive and very costly to produce. Why is Amtrak here? Well, yeah. Amtrak, you have to understand a little bit about the legal side of the world. Railroads are a common carrier, and they have to take freight and they have to take passengers. And they have to prove that they have to exist to do that. That's what the old Interstate Commerce Commission did, and the SURF Board, Surface Transportation Board. That's a legalistic process that they have to do. So as the passenger service was dying, it was very difficult to get trains and passenger service removed, because there was always somebody that said, well, my little Johnny sees the train coming in every day. And the Interstate Commerce Act was 1887, and that gave the legal aspects, all the laws that happened regarding railroads date back to that pretty much. And so I taught transportation, so I'm upon all of my acts and laws and things too. So when the railroads were trying to get out of the passenger business, there was no doubt nobody wanted them, and you didn't make any money with 20 passengers and a crew that was that big or bigger to support the 20 passengers with a dining car and sleeping cars and the conductor, the engineer, fireman, you know, front brakeman. When Amtrak came and it was going to relieve the railroads of their legal obligation as a common carrier to carry passengers, the railroads flocked to Amtrak as the solution to their passenger problem. And that's everybody joined and gave equipment, and the railroads were absolved of doing that, and then the railroads could
focus on freight and hauling.
Yeah, primarily freight, and are still painful. It takes a lot of effort to even run a passenger train and run it on schedule. The freight trains kind of run on schedule, but they're not scheduled as in the old days of a timetable and the guy with this pocket watch where he is. You know, if you run at 11 o'clock, that's fine. If you run at 12 o'clock, that's fine too. But not with a passenger train. Yeah, okay, Amtrak, yeah, and so it's an interesting thing, and I want to talk to you about this as something that you could add as a visual. There's a thing called ATCS, Automatic Train Control Systems. There's a schematic down at the plaza, at the Pacific Station Plaza, that has the diagram of the train movements on it. And I happen to be a member of that group and have been instrumental in getting the display working. You can watch the trains move as long as they don't technology themselves into encrypted information. But to run Amtrak, okay, there are only long platforms on what would be the south track of the double track Missouri Pacific Union Pacific Railroad. That means that to let passengers on and off, they try to get the long platforms where the train can stop and everybody can get out of the various cars on the train. So even today, watching the train dispatcher, who is located in Omaha for the Union Pacific, every afternoon, for example, every afternoon about 3 o'clock, he starts changing the direction of the trains on the two tracks from running like this to running like this. Why? Because this track has the long platforms. And so now he's flopping all the freight trains and everything out of the way so that Amtrak can go zooming by. And then as the evening, when the last of that process goes over, the railroad flips itself back again. But it's a pain in the butt to try and figure out where trains are going to be, and it's the Amtrak route going to Kansas City, for example. Once it gets west of Jefferson City, it's single track. So, and the freight trains go up along the river on the river sub. So passenger trains are just a pain, and they're a pain for Amtrak. Amtrak then runs to Congress and the surfboard and complains about how their trains are late all the time because the railroads don't pay enough priority attention to their movements, and the railroads are saying the money is in the freight. Please, can you imagine? There's like I see on the UP, they have solid trains of automobiles. There's 15 cars, automobiles, in every car on the train. And so there's at least 100 cars on the train. So that's a lot of automobiles that are $40,000, $50,000 a piece, that generates incredible amounts of revenue. And now you want to put a passenger train that's a pain in the butt to run out in front of that. If you go between St. Louis and Chicago, the new high speed, which is now up to 110 miles an hour for their Amtrak trains, the amount of taxpayer dollars that we have spent, there is a single track beside it that is for Amtrak. Super duper elevation, welded rail, concrete ties, fences through every town, crossing gates that totally block off the thing, and that's just for Amtrak so that you can put a bunch of people on and take them to Chicago and back in 3-4 hours. The railroad, the freight railroad, which also is Union Pacific, I might add, didn't need that, but the amount of money to do that, you're literally building a second railroad beside the one that's there just for the passengers, just so their trains can be on time. I was also involved in a movie with Gary Sinise called Truman, and it's a story of his 1948 tour for re-election. So the movie folks hired the 1522 steam locomotive out of here and got a couple of cars, and we filmed that just north of Kansas City. So that was a business car. There's no finer travel in the world than on a business car as a company officer. You have a business car is a self-contained hotel. You usually have a cook and a waiter, porter, attendant, and then an area to eat where the cook made the meals no microwave there, and bedrooms that were made up, and a little living room, and then the open platform on the back. And that is really a neat way to travel. I was the officer in charge on Burlington Northern for Bill Gates, who at that time was married to Melinda, and they decided that they wanted a vacation trip. So when you're Bill Gates, you can do that sort of thing. So he hired an 8-car passenger train for 10 days, and they got on at Livingston, Montana, and went from Livingston down to Denver, out to Utah, camped out. Yeah, but that was an interesting trip. Besides Bill and Melinda, I had Warren Buffett and his wife and the Hearst family from California all on the train. My role on that train was to make sure that everything was working, or the problems were resolved getting there. So when the Gates entourage left their campsite and went down in the Grand Canyon for a tour, my job was to get the train from Utah down through Las Vegas, out to Barstow, California, turn around, go back to Williams, Arizona, so that when they came up out of the Grand Canyon, there was their train, all nicely washed, brand new diesel on the front end of it, ready to go. And it wasn't that way when they got off, because I was having motive power problems. We lost one of the diesels, and got another one, and from the Union Pacific, which was an old freight locomotive, dirty, nasty looking thing. And I was working for Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and having a UP engine, so I called up and I said, I need to swap out an engine. And I called the power desk down in Fort Worth, Texas. And they said, is it running? I said, yeah, it's running fine. And they said, well, you can't have another engine. I said, right answer, wrong railroad answer. So I called the vice president that I reported to, and I said, here's the situation. Power desk says they can't have a different locomotive that says BNSF on it. And that night, a hotshot intermodal train stopped at Williams, Arizona, set out a brand new GE locomotive. We washed it by hand with a whole bunch of guys with brooms and buckets. And when Gates entourage came up out of the valley, and there was their train all set to go. Caterer had supper ready, the cars were all clean, and off to California we went. The technology that was here in 1853 was the technology that started Pacific as a town, because now the train stopped here, so the freight stopped here. It was mercantile, you know, the town just grew up. That downtown area was the only area in downtown Pacific at that time, and it had railroad people who made money, who worked at the shops, who were union people, you know, it was all. There was a lot of well, as I said, the station in downtown Pacific, in its day, was the airport terminal for St. Louis in today's world, you know. So everything focused around the downtown, and you get out into some of the smaller towns, like in western Minnesota, and the railroad still is important, because the local that comes to service the local industries, that's their clock. Well, is the local make it in yet today? Oh, you know, it's an hour late. Oh, okay. And then, you know, off you go and out to the field again. The farm communities are particularly that way. But Pacific was the place. It was ideally located, right spot, just with the water supply, and everything focused on Pacific until the 1920s. and then the rail, engines got bigger so they could go farther. They could take more water. The trains got bigger and they wanted to go farther. And the labor strike of 1920, which shut down the shops here, there wasn't anything that really grew in Pacific until it became kind of a bedroom community for like Chrysler, and then Chrysler left, and Pacific is still here. When I moved to town, do you know Jill Pigg at all?
Yeah.
Okay. She was mayor. Okay. And she came to me and says, I somehow the word got around that I was railroad, and there aren't that many retired railroad executive type that live in Pacific. And so she came to me and she says, what's the chances of getting a caboose for the town?
The Burlington Northern one down at the plaza.
And I said, well, 20 years ago it would have been a lot easier, but let me see what it is. This is 1998. So I called Fort Worth, and I said, what's the chances of getting a caboose? I said, well, not very good. He says, but I'll keep my eye out for it, and if one turns up someplace, I'll let you know. So I was doing an event called Galesburg Railroad Days, where we took the steam engine and we went and did dog and pony shows with because I knew museum people, and we'd get cars out and trains out of the Museum of Illinois Railway Museum. And having worked on the J and having worked on the BN, and the museum was on the Chicago Northwestern, which is UP today. But it's knowing people that will work on these crazy projects that you get. And so anyway, where was I going with that? Well,
you're talking about the caboose.
Oh yeah, the caboose. That's it. I lost my train of thought. So I happened to be up at Galesburg and setting up their town dog and pony show. And the guys, I talked with the terminal superintendent, and he says, over on the repair track, he says, I got 4 cabooses. 3 of them have disposition. 1 of them doesn't have a plate shed. It's just go to the scrapper. I said, hang on to keep that thought. Then I called Fort Worth and I said, I found a caboose. It's not earmarked for anyone, and if the railroad is willing to donate it to the city of Pacific, why they would like that. And I knew, it's people that you know, all the contacts that you know. And so they went over and took the caboose, which had been in a yard service basically as a platform to push cars, not a road caboose. But that's the very last caboose that Burlington Northern bought in the series of cabooses. That's a modern caboose. It was built in 1981. And so I said, well, okay. So I said, the city will have to, I'll make the arrangements, but the city's going to have to take the caboose from Burlington Northern and take it off the tracks. And I said, so I got R.J. Corman, which handled the big wreck that we had. Do you remember the...
That was 2011?
It might even be before that.
Somewhere.
It was 3 trains.
Yep. We have a whole bunch of photos. People took of that.
Talk about a mess. I was amazed that nobody got killed in that one.
I was too.
Because, do you know the story? Okay. Out here at the prison, okay, Dozier is the name of the station out there, and it's power crossovers that allow you to go like this and then allow you to go back the other way. And so they had a loaded coal train that was sitting eastbound at Dozier, waiting for an empty train, coal train, westbound coming out of St. Louis on the same track. And at Dozier, he was crossing from one track over to the other one. Coming down the hill in back of coal train number 1 is coal train number 2, and the crew fell asleep. And they hit the first coal train going 47 miles an hour. And like I said, and I was just absolutely amazed. And when the two trains hit, they bumped the cars from the wreck out onto the other track, and train number 3 hit it. So the wreck of the people that did the cleanup was R.J. Corman, because I was having a small fight with Hulcher at the time, because they derailed 1522 and tore it up. Anyway, so I said, so I got the Corman, and I said, okay, here's the deal. If I can get the BN guy to put this caboose on a train out of Galesburg, Illinois, which is 160 miles out of Chicago, and get it down here to St. Louis, and get it out to Pacific, you need to come in with your wrecking crew and lift it up. They use side boom cats. You probably have not seen this, but it's a bulldozer, and it's got kind of a cantilever type of thing off to the side, and it'll lift cars. It'll lift cars up small distances and put them on the track, and the cats can move around. So I said okay, and they said, well, we won't make a guarantee, but if we don't have a wreck, I'll have the wreck team out with the pair of cats and the whole bit. So the day came. The caboose, meanwhile, comes trundling down into St. Louis, gets out on a train, goes as far as Cuba, to where the local is. That's its home base. And the local brings the caboose up to Pacific. And here comes Corman with their cats and so forth. Everything's all set up here beside the track. And the local comes in. The caboose is on the rear of the train. They cut the caboose off, left it sitting there all by itself. The crew and the rest of the train go into St. Louis. And here's Corman with the caboose sitting on the main line of BNSF. It was BNSF by that time. And they just reached over, picked it straight up. The cats moved it right off the track, turned it around, plop, right down on where the plaza is today. It wasn't a plaza then yet, and in fact the partnership wasn't even there. I was first. No, I wasn't the first president of the partnership, but I was the one that got the property all leased and cleaned up and so forth.